Yeah. Am I on now?
Yeah, we're live.
All right. Perfect. Welcome everybody. Today's stream is a little bit different. Um, we're going to be doing. I think I can hear something. Maybe you guys can go on mute. I'm not sure.
It's on Frank's end. I can hear it too.
Oh yeah. Um, yeah. So today's stream is going to be a little bit different in that we're going to be going over this new tutorial that we've launched, and I'll primarily be sort of explaining what's in the tutorial. But one of the neat things about this is that we get a chance to go through what the setup would look like for a person that's using SST for the first time. So this stream will end up embedding it back into the tutorial later. But the idea is that we want to cover most of the key concepts um, that you sort of need to use SST, and we'll do it as I sort of work my way through the tutorial itself. To give you some context, if you go over to our docs and if you click on Learn or the Preface part of Learn, that brings up this new tutorial that we have. And as I sort of work through it, if you guys have any sort of questions, you can kind of post them in the chat and we'll try and answer them either towards the end of it, or if it ends up being something that I can kind of address right away, I'll sort of do that. But we've got Frank and Dax here. In a bit, we'll sort of hide them from the screen and I'll sort of work through it, but I'll bring them back in once we've got sort of questions. Obviously, these are the guys that they've sort of worked on this. Dax, kind of put the entire sort of starter together, the starter that we'll be using, that I'll be discussing in a second. And Frank has obviously built all the sort of constructs and stuff. And so, if you got any sort of like detailed questions that are maybe above what I can sort of answer, I'll sort of pull them back in. But with that, let's get started. Yeah, maybe you guys can sort of hide your things, and then I'll kick it off. Wait. Yeah. All right. There we go. Okay. No, so I have it running on my TV here. So if I'm looking off into the distance a little bit, it's because I'm seeing if it's up there, and there's a bit of a lag, so just have to kind of wait for it to sort itself out. So here we go. We've got this new tutorial, and what this is primarily doing is it's teaching you the sort of concepts of SST. One of the things that we have launched recently is the starter. And so what this tutorial is doing is teaching you how to build a full stack application using that starter that we have. To give a little bit of background, you can think about SST as a collection of constructs and sort of a build and deployment tool for a full stack application. The starter, on the other hand, is taking all of that and using the sort of ecosystem, the broader ecosystem of both application code. So in this case, we're using sort of GraphQL on the API layer, but also stuff on the front end, and we're sort of using React with Vite on the front end, and we've got some stuff that we're using to sort of style our application. So putting all of that together in a sort of cohesive experience is what our starter does. And so the tutorial is working our way through essentially the sort of process of building an application using that starter. So when you first sort of land on this, the first thing that we kind of ask you to do is to join our Discord community. And this is primarily because we're kind of in there almost the entire time, sort of answering questions. And if you guys are on there now, I'll just sort of pull it up on my phone here. But if you guys are kind of on there now and you've got sort of questions, we'll try and monitor that as well. But give me 1 second. But that's one of the first things that we'd like you guys to do, is to join our sort of Discord community and post any of the questions that you might have. Anyway, so to move along, what we're going to be building is this like very simplified Reddit clone, and the starter comes essentially with that. So you're able to kind of like post links. You can post a title, and this thing basically just shows you a list of all the things that have been sort of posted to it. There's no authentication currently. It's everything's sort of public. It's a single page application. What we're going to be doing, though, is we're going to be adding a new feature to it. So we're going to allow our users to be able to post comments to these links that are being submitted. By the way, the entire sort of application, as we kind of build it through the tutorial, is available on GitHub here. There is a repo that's available that you can kind of go through and look at, what are the changes that we're sort of going to be making. So if you're working through the tutorial and you're having a hard time at a certain step, you're not sure, hey, where were we supposed to add what again? You can kind of go look at that a little bit later. So that's there for reference. Here's roughly what we'll be going through in the tutorial. So first things we're going to do is we're going to create a new SST application with that starter that I just sort of mentioned. We'll set up your local development environment. We'll look at from the lens of adding this new feature. Let's write to the database. Let's basically let's just create a new table for our comments feature. Write up the code, the domain code, and I'll be explaining a lot of that through the tutorial. But write up the domain code that will that'll let you sort of write to that database table that we just sort of created. Connect it up with your API, then show that on the front end, allow you to sort of post the comments on the front end, and then finally deploy it to production. Just the sort of normal workflow that you might have as you're working through a full stack application. The next little bit that I kind of want to cover is sort of what's in the starter. The starter, as I was sort of mentioning before, is more than just the core of SST. And the reason for this is most people, when they go through their first sort of journey into serverless, and quite a few of you that might be sort of watching might be people that are just looking to sort of learn serverless in itself. It's not just about the sort of infrastructure that most serverless providers have. Your goal is to build an application, and so there's this broader ecosystem of tools that you have to kind of plug into to be able to do this. And so one of the things that we spent a lot of time on, and Dax primarily sort of did this, was go and look at the ecosystem of sort of tools that are available and see and essentially look for the ones that work the best within a serverless context. And so there are things that we do in there that are sort of specific to the serverless way of doing things a little bit. But at kind of a broader level, what we are building is, we're using SST to kind of define the constructs and basically describe our infrastructure for our application. We're using Postgres as our database. It's hosted through RDS on AWS. We're using GraphQL as our sort of API layer. We're using React on the front end. But these sort of, I have a list of a few libraries here that we'll be touching on a little bit later in the tutorial. But there are a certain set of libraries that we spend quite a bit of time trying to figure out that would be sort of the best fit for this sort of use case. And so we've got I think it's called Keasley, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to say that I'm pretty sure I'm saying it wrong now, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to say it some other way in the rest of the stream. But it's a type safe query builder for SQL effectively. Then on top of that, we have Pothos. And one of our previous streams, we had the creator of Pothos sort of join us and kind of talk about his project a little bit. But it's also it's a type safe schema builder for GraphQL, and we've got essentially for our front end to talk to our GraphQL API, we have a combination of Urkel and GenQL, which allows us to make essentially type safe queries to our GraphQL API. And then we've got something called Vanilla Extract, which is a CSS in TS preprocessor. the key here being, you're sort of catching this already, is that there's a whole lot of sort of TypeScript going on. And so there's this one thing that I kind of want to address before we get started, which is, why TypeScript? To be honest, on my side personally, and if you've sort of followed some of my work before, we had put together the guide for building full stack serverless applications, and that wasn't in TypeScript. So this is a bit of a change from what we've done in the past. And so some of the sort of common concerns that we kind of hear, and I frankly had them as well, is that, hey, don't I have to do a lot of extra work just to get sort of TypeScript to work in my application? Don't I need to write all these like types all over the place? Hey, I've looked at TypeScript code bases; they look really scary. There's so much going on. Won't the JavaScript version of this just look a lot easier? And those are obviously sort of valid concerns. And you hear, a lot of sort of proponents of TypeScript kind of talk about how, hey, no, the reason you should be using this is because TypeScript is just so much more maintainable. And I have a section in this tutorial that sort of talks about, who are we sort of targeting with SST, as in like, who's the sort of ideal user for SST? And for us, it is a startup that is looking to build their entire application with serverless, and take that application or take that setup right from when they launch their product all the way to when they go sort of public. And so a big part of maintainability, comes from the fact that you're working in a TypeScript code base. The idea being that, if you go out, a year from now and you're making a change in a part of a code base that you haven't touched in a really long time, you should feel confident in making those changes. If you've worked, if you've been a developer for a little bit, and if you've run into this specific scenario, that, if there's a part of a code base that you're sort of comfortable working in, that you're sort of working in day to day, versus a one that you haven't touched in a while, you're definitely not making changes as rapidly in the part that you're sort of not familiar with as much. And TypeScript sort of changes that a little bit. It makes it so that it's relatively easy to make these changes in parts of the code base that you're not familiar with, because things are sort of connected and wired up in a way that will sort of let you know that you're making changes the right way. You don't, when you're working in a part of a code base that you sort of know and you're kind of familiar with, you're holding a lot of those things in your head, versus a case where you're not sure, hey, what am I expecting? What is this function expecting? Where is this property coming from? And then the next thing you know, you're tracing through the rest of that part of the code base to try and figure out exactly how stuff works. TypeScript fixes a lot of those things. However, and all of that sort of said, when somebody would sort of pitch that to me, I would be like, yeah, I get it. I know that's a problem, but I don't know if putting in all these sort of types and adding all of this, or like adopting this like new way of writing code, is worth all of the sort of maintainability that comes with it. And it took me a little bit, and I think this is sort of shifting in the community as well. It took me a little bit to sort of realize, and Dax made some very sort of strong points on this, but it took me a little bit to sort of realize that if the library authors, so these are the people that are writing the packages that you're kind of using, if these folks are using, or they are designing their APIs for their packages or for their libraries, with a TypeScript first perspective, then you don't have to write a lot of additional types on top of that. And what ends up happening in that sort of scenario is that is that your code base does not look a lot more different from just a regular JavaScript code base. In fact, as we work through this tutorial, this is one of the things that, especially if you're a sort of JavaScript developer, you're going to find that sort of surprising, in that, we're like, literally, there's, through this sort of the entire tutorial, like there's this the feature that we're adding, there's just one sort of instance where we have to write an extra bit of a type, and even that is like relatively straightforward. Now, that's not to say that that's how it's going to be forever, but the reality is that if you're working in a code base like the one that I'm about to sort of show you, where everything is has sort of end-to-end type safety, and we're using packages that are well designed for this sort of use case from a TypeScript first perspective, then your experience isn't all that different from just sort of writing general JavaScript code, while you still get the benefits of everything else. So what that kind of means is that, the input types of functions are sort of figured out for you. You don't have to specify them very much. The return types are sort of figured out for you. You don't have to specify that either. So the actual code that you're writing doesn't look all that different. Anyway, the other part I should sort of mention is that, again, if on top of that you still need a little bit of convincing, TypeScript can be sort of gradually adopted. You don't, even within this code base, you can still write JavaScript if you want. Like that option is still sort of available to you. All right, given all of that, I've sort of spent a bunch of time with that already. Given all of that, let's get to it. So the first step is creating an actual project. I cheated here a little bit, so I have I have a project sort of up and running. But what I'm gonna do here, let me see, let me get sort of set up here. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna run this command anyway, but I'll this is like one of those like cooking shows, where they're like, hey, you put all the stuff in the oven, and the next thing you know, they have something that's like cooked and ready already. I'm kind of going to do that just because, and I'll tell you this in a sort of second, just because it takes a little bit to sort of bootstrap an application with SST for the first time. I'll tell you why. So this is the command that you're running. You're running create SST. Currently, this command has a few different modes. It has the GraphQL starter, the one that we're going to use, but you also have sort of a minimal mode. Plus, we have a large library of examples that you can sort of pull from. The minimal mode is meant for sort of advanced folks. Advanced is maybe not the right term, but it's meant for folks that maybe know a little bit more about SST at this point. And instead of using the sort of like the ecosystem of packages that I've been sort of referring to, instead of using those, the ones that you want to use, and so you just want a minimal setup. That's not what we're going to be doing. We're going to use our GraphQL starter here. You get a choice of databases. So there's RDS and DynamoDB. These are both on AWS. In the future, we're probably going to have support for a bunch of other providers as well. But for now, these are the ones that we have. We're going to go with RDS because it's familiar, or Postgres in this case, because it's familiar to most people. In the future, we might do a DynamoDB version of a tutorial as well, because the tooling there is also quite good, and it's truly serverless on some level. So we sort of pick that. You pick in a project name. In this case, I'm just going to put something dummy. It creates a project for you, and as that's sort of done running, you kind of go into that directory and you do an npm install. It's fairly straightforward. I'll sort of just hold off on that for a second. Something to sort of point out, as we're working through this tutorial, or as you are working through this tutorial at some point, there are these sort of little icons, like this little keyboard icon that'll sort of show up from time to time. That's basically saying, out of these code snippets, this is the one that you actually do need to work on, or you need to make a change as you're working through the tutorial. There are other bits like this one, for example. It's like it is more of sort of an explanation, but really, like, you need to kind of run that so that you can eventually get here and you can decide what you want to do. So anyway, so we have this sort of part up and running. This is the part that I was sort of saying, I'm going to flip back to the one that I kind of have. I'm going to stop the version that I was sort of running. And the key command that we run here is called SST start. If you're not familiar with SST, or if you haven't heard about it at all, one of the big features of it is this live Lambda development environment. And I'm going to kind of start it up here. And it takes a little bit to do a couple of things, and we go through that a little bit later. So we'll flip back to that in a second. But if you're running this for the first time, what this command will do, and I wasn't in that case, but if you were running it for the first time, it'll ask you to use a name for the stage that you're going to work in. So a stage is basically a way to think about like different environments. Because SST, and we'll talk about this in detail, but because SST gives you a local development environment for each of anybody that's sort of using it. If you're working within a team, you'd ideally want to use sort of a unique name so that you're not overriding your work. So when you do SST start, one of the things it's doing is it's sort of deploying everything that you have into AWS. And the stage name allows us to sort of namespace those resources so that if you've got a friend of yours that's working on the same project, you're working on the same team, and they sort of deploy it as well, because it might be going the same AWS account, we want to make sure that those resources are sort of separate. So that is the one thing that you'll kind of get asked to do. And what this does is, if you've got the AWS credentials sort of set up, and we have a sort of step in here just at the top of this page that helps you kind of set this up. It's relatively straightforward. You don't have to set up the AWS CLI, but you just need to put in the AWS keys into your computer. And once you have that sort of set up, what SST will do is it will sort of figure out. Sort of scroll back up to that point again. Where'd it go? Right. It'll sort of figure out, hey, the name of the credentials that you have here, in my case, it's called J. Do you want to use that? It's quite likely that if you're working within a team, everybody on the team is given a different set of credentials. And so this ends up being a good way to kind of make it unique. But if it isn't, then you can just sort of pick a unique name for yourself. This gets stored locally. So if you wipe out, let's say, the local sort of source code that you have, and you get it from, let's assume it was on GitHub, and you get it again, it'll ask you this again. But anyway, if you have the credentials sort of set up correctly, then it should pick up the right one. Like for me, all of my local stages are always called J. Okay, so let's get to SST start. While this thing is running in the background, let me just tell you really quickly what it's actually doing. So the first thing it does is it bootstraps your AWS account for SST. So assuming you've never run SST in your AWS account, it kind of sets up some basic bits of infrastructure that SST sort of needs to coordinate, deployments or your local environments across all of your apps. And so there's these like couple of resources that it basically sets up in your AWS account. It only does that sort of once per account. So the sort of second time you sort of run it, won't need to kind of do that. It then sets up some infrastructure to run this live Lambda development environment, and we'll talk about that a little more in detail in a second. But it's this way of basically letting you work on your applications kind of locally. And the third thing it does is it actually deploys your app to AWS. So imagine, like in this case, we've got the sort of starter, the sort of Reddit clone. It puts that onto AWS. So this is what's sort of different between working in a serverless application with SST versus working on maybe a traditional application where you do most of your work locally. In this case, you actually do majority of your work in the cloud or in AWS. So what this does is it deploys, a full on, like your entire application almost as is, to AWS, to your AWS account. The fourth thing it does is it starts up a local server. And this local server does a couple of things. One is it allows us to basically proxy requests from your application that's deployed to AWS down to your local machine. So this is kind of what allows you to work on your code locally. Again, we'll look at that in a second. And it also powers what we call is the SST console. And we'll also look at that in a second. It's like this web-based dashboard that basically connects to your local environment. Okay. Let's go on to the next thing. So let's assume SST started sort of running for you, and if you're going through this tutorial with me, or if you're going through it on your own, it'll take a little bit. So while that's happening, because it's actually deploying it to AWS in this case, it takes a little bit. So while that's happening, let's go through and look at what your project structure actually looks like. So I'm gonna open up Visual Studio Code here. I'm going to close this one for a second. Let's collapse everything. So at a very high level, we've got some dot directories. We'll ignore that for a second. But at a very high level, there is a stacks directory, there is a services directory, and there is a web directory. What these sort of stand for is the stacks directory is basically a description of all of your infrastructure. So these are the constructs, the SST constructs that you might have heard about, or that we'll sort of talk about in detail. There is a services directory. This is effectively your application code. So, in the past, if you were writing maybe an Express application or a Ruby on Rails application, this is kind of that. So this is the stuff that most of this kind of gets sent to and gets run in AWS Lambda. So this is kind of like your application code. And then you have the web directory, which is just in our case, it is a static, single page application. It's a React app. So that is that. We also have this GraphQL directory. In our case, we're using GraphQL. This directory is mostly code generated. So there isn't, like, you won't find yourself sort of editing a lot of things in this directory, but it needs to be checked into source control. So there, as it sort of generates changes while it's being code gen, those changes need to be committed into Git. The .vs code directory, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, is it basically has a configuration file that allows your SST application to work really nicely in VS Code. And we'll see that in a second. The .sst directory, you might sort of remember we were talking about how we have these sort of stage names. That is what sort of gets stored in here, and there are a bunch of other things that get stored in here. So if you wipe this thing out and you start again, it'll basically ask you that question again. It's like, hey, what do you want to deploy it under? .build is again sort of like a lot of sort of temp files that are generated as a part of the SST build process. The .templates is it allows you to basically write templates for your migration files, for database migration files, and you can do a lot more with this, but currently that's effectively what we're going to be doing. And so that also gets checked into it, but lets you sort of customize it. Most likely you probably won't be doing that, but it's in there in case you do sort of need to customize it. So anyway, as a whole, that's kind of what it is. And if I go back to the tutorial here, now I sort of mentioned the fact that this is all put together as a mono repo. In our case, I was using, when I was sort of running these commands, I was using npm. So npm has a concept of workspaces now. Yarn has that as well. But when you think about what an SST application is, and the fact that there's your application code, your infrastructure code, and your front-end code all sort of living together, that effectively means that you kind of need a way to sort of manage all that together, and monorepo ends up being kind of the best way of doing it. By the way, this entire chapter in the tutorial is giving you a lot of background. If you're going through it really quickly, you can probably sort of skip this. And I'll just go through it fairly quickly. We talked about the stacks. There's some sort of stack definitions, and I can sort of show you that really quickly, but it is relatively straightforward, and the actual details of it we might sort of touch on later on in the tutorial. But the first thing that we do is we start up an RDS Postgres database, and over here, we're kind of specifying the engine. We're specifying where our migrations sort of live, and we'll sort of look at that a little bit later. After it's created, we are then grabbing the sort of parameters that we kind of need. Like, you can think about, hey, anytime I need to connect to my database, there's a bunch of things that I kind of need on a client level. We then put this inside this thing called a config, which is basically SST's way of managing environment variables securely. You can read about that in our docs a little bit later. That then gets fed into our API. So our API stack, and stacks you can kind of think of as basically a way of organizing, large sets of infrastructure resources sort of separately. So in this case, we have a sort of neat separation of, there's our API, there's our database, there's our web, which is our front end. We're just sort of separating them. They could all live together technically in one stack, but there's a limit on the number of resources that you can have in a stack. So it just makes sense that when you start out, you start organizing things a little bit better as is. One neat thing that we're doing in the stack is that we're importing our database stack. All right. So this API stack is importing our database stack, and everything that the database stack is sort of returning, we're able to sort of pull in here. And really what we're doing is we're basically saying the API has permissions to talk to the database. And we're passing a bunch of config, which is, those things that we talked about, like how do I actually connect to my database? We're passing that in, again, sort of using this the config idea, and we're passing that into our our API. We're defining a GraphQL API. We'll look at that a little bit later. There are a bunch of different sort of things that we're kind of doing in there. But that's about it. And then when we go over to sort of the website, we're pulling in the API because the web needs to know what is the API endpoint that I'm going to be talking to. And you can kind of see that for our Vite React app, we are passing in basically this thing called the GraphQL URL. So where's our GraphQL API? What's kind of neat about this is that oh yeah, Devin's sort of saying, oh, okay, cool. It looks like Dax might have sort of shifted that around. Yeah, my camera was probably blocking the files there. But what's kind of neat about this this API sort of URL is that traditionally when we were working on full stack applications, there wasn't a really good way to sort of connect your front end and your back end together. What that meant was you would basically deploy your backend, you would get the URL from your backend, and then you would kind of like hard code that into your front end. And so if you had multiple environments, so let's say you had like a development environment and a production environment, you had to hard code 2 different URLs into your front end now. And then depending on what the deployment is, like what the target is or whatever, it would like pick the one that it needs to talk to. And that's fine. The one neat thing that SST can do, because again, if you sort of zoom out, you have your infrastructure, you have your application code, and you have your front end code. Because they all live together in effectively the same project, we're able to tie those things in together. So you can think of this entire project being deployed to to production, to development, to PR stages, and they will all get their own set of resources and their own URLs, but they're all wired up internally together and they're not hard coded. So that effectively means that single unit of an application can work in a lot of different contexts without you having to make any changes. And this is effectively the thing that powers, in some ways, our local development environment as well. So we're talking about how you and your friend are working on the same team together. You could be working on the same application, and there literally is no sort of configuration that your friend or you need to make for it to work on your computer, because that same application just needs to know where I'm sort of deploying this thing to, which is the AWS account, let's say, and it's all wired up internally, so it just works sort of out of the box. So this one's kind of a neat little example of a very small thing that we're able to do because of the fact that everything sort of lives together. Okay, all right. So we have that. We kind of touched on this already. We touched on this as well. We'll briefly look at the services thing. This is more specific to our starter than it is to SST in this case. But again, if you sort of recall how I was talking about the fact that we spend a bunch of time looking at the ecosystem to try and find things that work really well in a serverless context and that work really well given kind of our requirements a little bit. This is sort of neat to know. The one big thing is that the core directory inside services is where most of our actual business logic lies, and it's organized using this thing called domain-driven design, which I'll touch on. You might already sort of know about it, but I'll kind of touch on that a little bit later. So that's basically where most of our actual code is. Functions are, and you might have kind of guessed, we're using serverless here, so these things are getting run inside Lambda functions, and so functions are effectively where those actual sort of function handlers are. On their own, the function handlers don't do a ton. They effectively just call into what's in your core. Migrations are database migrations, and we'll sort of look at that a little bit later. You can also write tests. We're not touching on that in the tutorial, but we do have sort of docs on that. Okay, the final bit, we talked about how the GraphQL one, it's sort of auto-generated. The web we sort of already sort of touched on. It's basically it's a stock React application with Vite. There isn't a whole lot going on there. I might have changed a couple of things there just to add sort of style support for it, and we'll look at that a little bit later. But it's you can basically throw that away and do whatever. You can put whatever sort of flavor of a, in this case, a static site that you want. We do have options for things like remix. or Next.js, but you can sort of dig into our docs for that one. Finally, in our package.json, I'd sort of touched on the fact that we're using a monorepo. These are the workspaces that we have. We've got the services, our application code. We've got GraphQL, the sort of code gen directory, and we've got the web directory, which is our front end code. You might note that our stacks directory is actually not a workspace. And this is maybe a little bit outside the scope of this tutorial, but our stacks is a way of sort of defining our infrastructure. It isn't an actual application in and of itself. It's just it's basically allowing you to configure these workspaces and how they are going to be deployed. So we'll sort of leave that for a little bit later maybe. And then there are some ways on how you kind of like install packages into workspaces and stuff. If you're not familiar with how workspaces kind of work in the NPM or the Yarn world. We also have a bunch of scripts on the top level. I'll kind of just show you that really quickly so that you kind of know what you're doing. This is in your project root. We already saw SST start. We ran that once already. Deploy will basically deploy this to production. We'll look at that a little bit later. Remove cleans everything up. Console starts up the console command explicitly. So console starts up the SST console explicitly. It automatically gets started up with the SST start command. But let's say you were not running SST start and you want to sort of connect to it, it'll kind of do that for you. Type check is if you just want to sort of run a type check across your application, you might want to do this as a part of your CI. Test, we have sort of test command. Again, we're not quite talking about that in this tutorial. We'll do that a little bit later. And then the hygen, this allows you to kind of run these migration scripts essentially. The build command, though, what that's sort of doing is it's basically a step that is running as a part of the deploy step. But in some cases, people might want to just see, hey, what, just package the entire application right before the deploy step and show me what the output looks like. In some cases, people, might want to split up the two steps, or they just might want to sort of debug into some issues. So that's kind of what that one does. But other than that, it's a relatively straightforward package JSON. And then finally, there's like this SST JSON file. There isn't a whole lot in there. It's just pointing to just tell SST is basically saying, tell me where can I run my application, and so, or where can I run the infrastructure for my application. So if I kind of go back here, we had looked at sort of the different part of the stack. So I sort of collapse that. We looked at the API database and the web sort of stack. The index file is essentially pulling all of your stacks together. So in this case, we're like importing all of them. We're basically saying, hey, our app has these stacks. So we kind of put them in there. And then it also allows us to specify for all the functions across our application to specify some defaults. So in this case, we want to run node 16. All of our functions or all of our application code is inside the services directory, and we want to use ESM, and we're bundling them up. But it's just sort of good to know that the index is basically the entry point of your application. We've got a couple of other chapters in here, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but just to sort of say that we maybe unlike some of the other sort of frameworks out there, we really care about your local development experience, and that includes how it works with your code editor. In this case, we're using VS Code, and I sort of talked about how there's some configuration in there. But you can also set it up with IntelliJ and WebStorm. And what that will allow you to do, and we're not going to do it in this tutorial, but what that allows you to do is set breakpoints and debug your Lambda functions locally. And we have some configuration that makes it so that all of that sort of works out of the box. The other thing, because we've got sort of this end-to-end sort of type safety in how we've defined SST's constructs, we have a really neat autocomplete feature for almost everything that you have. That also comes with a bunch of examples, so you probably don't need to look at our docs or API docs explicitly if you wanted to sort of see how something's working and look at it in your editor itself. And the type safety thing is basically it'll just yell at you if you make mistakes. So not a whole lot there. That said, let's sort of get started. So at this point, our thing should be running. I'm just going to I'm just going to refresh. I'm going to start sort of fresh here. Let's so this what we're looking at is the is our console, and what we have here after our SST start process completes is basically it's deploying all the different stacks that we have, and it's printing out the outputs from these stacks. So our API has an API endpoint. Our website, our static site has sort of an endpoint as well, and we have kind of the GraphQL endpoint as well. This is the one that sort of gets fed into the React app. And then after it's done running, it'll be like, hey, you can go to this URL to look at your application. What's kind of neat about this, so this is the URL. If you just go to console.sst.dev after you have SST start running, it'll automatically connect to it. In this case, I'm using Safari. If you're using Safari, you might have to, and we have kind of a link to that. We'll sort of talk about that a little bit later, but we kind of have a link to in our docs and how to sort of set that up with Safari, but it works out of the box in Chrome for you. What this is kind of doing is it's connecting to your local terminal, and it's basically picking up all of the logs and kind of displaying it in a way that it's a little bit easier to sort of parse, but also you can kind of like replay these events, and you can do a bunch of different things with it. And that is just the sort of local development tab that we have, the live Lambda tab that we have over here. That's just the logs that you're getting from your Lambda functions. But we also do a bunch of different things. And for now, the thing that we're going to look at is the RDS tab. And this thing already knows, it's like, hey, you've got a bunch of sort of databases here. In this case, it's connecting to the right sort of default database that we have sort of specified in our stacks code. If I just sort of go back to the tutorial, I'm sort of going through what we're kind of asking you to do. The first thing we're going to ask you to do is, after you get to the RDS tab, and here we have, if you're using Safari or Brave, we've got sort of a link to how to kind of set that up for you. Is the first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually run a migration. So you can kind of think of like, we've started up our application. It's running on AWS, but our database is like completely empty at this point. And so by default, we have a migration kind of for you. So I'm going to open up the migration here. And this is the same thing that we have in the tutorial. But all this is doing is creating a new article table. So this will store kind of the articles, the URLs, and the titles. And in this case, there's like a timestamp for when they're sort of submitted. The up function in the migration, if you're not familiar with migrations, the up function in the migration is basically saying, what happens when I apply this migration? The down function in the migration is saying, what happens when I undo the migration? So in this case, what we're going to kind of ask you to do, because this thing already sort of exists and you don't have to kind of make these changes, is what we're going to ask you to do is to go and kind of apply that migration. I sort of did that already, so I'm just going to open it up on the side here. I actually applied the next one as well, but we'll look at that in a little bit. But you can go and you can click and you can apply the migration. If you click on it again, you can undo it as well. But for now, after you apply the migration, you can then run a query. So I'm going to try and do that. Put it in here. And the query is basically saying that there are no rows, but you can kind of see like our table has been created. You can see it's like it has the article ID, it has a title, it has a URL. So that's kind of our first step. Like what we've really done is like we've basically set up our table for the first time. If you're working through this tutorial, from here on out, you'll notice these like behind the scenes sections that I have. What that's really about is, and what I kind of realized at some point is that there's some folks, I think I'm in that sort of bucket. There's some folks that they don't just want to do the tutorial, they want to know what's going on, like how did it actually work. Because you can kind of think about this, for a second, where we looked at, you've got something running in your terminal, right? And somehow when you go to console.sst.dev, which is obviously running on the internet, it's somehow like connecting to your local, and you're able to do these sort of things. And so some of these behind the scenes stuff are basically, they give you a sense of how some of the stuff works. So in this case, it's kind of telling you, look, we did SST start, that started up our live Lambda environment and our SST console. We deployed everything to AWS, right? Which set up a RDS Postgres database. We then went to the console. It picked up all the migrations in our services migrations directory. We then clicked to apply one of them, and then we did a query. What's kind of neat about this is the Postgres database is obviously not in your computer, right? It's on AWS. And so when we finally did this like query, it's making a query to something that's in production, or it's in live. Sorry, I shouldn't say production. It's just live. All right, let's do the next step. So now that guy's up and running, and I think I did this one already, but I'll do it again. So if we look at our project root, we'll go into the web directory, and this is again, I won't clear that. And this is again the Vite static site that we have. So this command that I'm running is obviously very specific to Vite. If you're using something else, it'll probably bring something else up for you. And it shows that our thing is running on 3000. I'm going to refresh this. And that's what our sort of starter looks like. It lets you post like these links, and I think we'll post that in a second. I forget where I actually do that in the thing, but anyway, it brings up your React app that's running locally. And oh yeah, this is kind of neat. So I'm going to go in, and I am going to go back to our local tab here, and it's showing all of the sort of requests or invocations that are being made in your application. But if I refresh this, you'll see that we made a request to our GraphQL endpoint. And the GraphQL endpoint is basically saying, hey, there are no articles in here. And so what's kind of neat about this is that, like, this, again, it's like plugging into your local environment, and you get this nice sort of web-based interface to debug stuff. I also have kind of a behind the scenes on how the whole sort of request flow kind of happened, and you can kind of read that at some point. But by this point, you should sort of have an idea. All right, let's go ahead and let's go ahead and submit something. So I'm going to type something in here. I'm going to submit a link. And it takes me to another page where the sort of link is submitted. This is just to show you what the starter actually comes with. Again, like we haven't written any code yet. But so the homepage shows you a list of links. You click on the link, and it'll show you kind of the page where the sort of link lives. So essentially, there are like two routes in this application. And we made some requests in here. I don't know which one was okay. So this one's sort of returning. Let me see if I can find the one that actually made the, I don't know where it is. Oh, there it is. All right, there we go. So this guy is kind of saying that, and we'll look at this in detail a little bit later, but this is sending a mutation to our GraphQL API to actually create the article. All right, here we go. So we have that done. And the next chapter that we have in the tutorial shows you how to do sort of breakpoint debugging. I'm not going to do that in the tutorial. I'm not going to do it in the stream, at least. You can play around with it. This is more, if I was to do it, it'll seem a little synthetic and it'll seem a little fake. But when you run into these cases, you can kind of do it on your own. And the way this sort of works is within VS Code, you can go in and set breakpoints. Sorry, you can go in and set breakpoints, and you would need to run SST start from VS Code as opposed to what we've been doing so far. And then once you sort of run it from there, and you, let's say, refresh the page on your React app, it'll hit the breakpoint that you have. in this case, it's like in your services directory. And what's kind of neat is that you'll be able to see exactly what all the sort of variables and everything that you're expecting in here, and they're all coming directly from the actual AWS Lambda function event. So it's not like a mocked event locally or whatever. It's actually coming from AWS. And then finally, you can like kind of step over and you can kind of continue sort of executing. And if you're sort of familiar with setting breakpoints, you'll kind of know this. I'm not a huge breakpoints person, but the advantage that you still get, even if you weren't using sort of breakpoints, the advantage that you get out of SST start is that all of these things that are running live, all of this is this data is coming effectively again from AWS. So you're working against a real database, against a real like API endpoint. So up to this point, and I think we've already covered quite a bit in terms of time here. This is basically giving you kind of an intro into what your local development environment sort of looks like, and it should give you kind of a sense, into, I guess, a way that we think about this as a team as well. We spend a bunch of time here because we want this part of the process to be really enjoyable for you. So now we're ready to add a new feature. To add a new feature, we give you basically like our starter has this sort of code organization pattern in some ways, if you will, of a thing called domain-driven design. And the reason we care about this at this level is, again, if you go back to what I was sort of saying about, who our sort of ideal user is somebody that is going to be working with the same code base for a long time. Maintainability is a big part of that. And we really care about, helping you work on a code base that doesn't look scary, that looks fun to work with, on day one, as it hopefully will, a year down the road. And so domain-driven design is basically, and this chapter in the tutorial is very light on this, on covering the core concepts here. But essentially what the idea is, if we go back to our code, is that we have this core code here. You can ignore the SQL ones here for a second, but we'll just look at the article. The article file that we have has a bunch of functions that it exports that's basically telling the rest of your application, hey, for the article domain or the article concept that we have in our application, and that is core to obviously this Reddit clone that we're building, here are the actions that you can do to it. You can, in this case, you can create it, you can get a specific one, and you can list all of them that we have. The way they're implemented shouldn't necessarily, these functions, that is, the way these functions are implemented shouldn't necessarily matter to the rest of your application that is calling into it. An example of that is, let's say you had a simple REST API endpoint that was getting like a specific article. It takes that from, let's say, the query string, and it calls this function, and it returns and displays that on the page, let's say. That API endpoint that is calling this function doesn't need to know that you're using SQL or you're using NoSQL. Like it shouldn't matter to it. It shouldn't even matter necessarily, how are you structuring the code within, or how are you structuring rather data, I should say, in your database when it comes to storing these articles. And what that allows you to do, and I sort of talk about that at a very high level. So that's effectively what domain-driven design is, again, at a very, very high level. What that allows you to do is that as your application gets larger and larger, or you're worked on for a really long time, A, we're able to hide these implementation details, but B, you begin to develop these concepts as you're working within your application, where you can abstract these essentially these domains out of how you think about things. So you can just go, hey, I know there is an article get function, and I can reliably call it, and it'll always do what I'm sort of expecting without me having to know exactly how it sort of works. And so then you have these set of primitives you can think of that are specific to your business that your application can now rely on, for years to come. It also makes it so that because you've isolated these things out in some ways, you can then go out later on, you can refactor parts of them without affecting the people that are calling into it. There's almost like the sense that you have a contract between a person that is using your domain code and you sort of as a person that is sort of like implementing it. Like there is a contract in what is being expected, but it's up to you in how you want to sort of implement or refactor it moving forward. We have a really nice video on that Dax sort of put together as a part of his sort of SST weekly series. This is the thing that we do on our YouTube channel. And it covers this in a lot more detail and why we care about this. Anyway, given that, let's actually get started. So the thing that we're going to do is we're going to add something to our like domain code now. This is, we're going to add add comment and a comments, which is basically like give me all the comments function to our to our article domain. So I'm just going to put that in there. Obviously, these functions don't do anything at this point, but you can kind of see, talking about sort of domain-driven design a little bit, you can think about like this is sort of the contract. It's like, hey, for adding a comment, I expect that it takes a string as the article ID, and I expect that it takes a string as the text. And again, like, when you're giving me sort of the list of comments here, sure, yeah, right. For a given article ID, give me all the sort of comments that you need. Okay, the next step that we need to do is we need to actually put a table together in our database that allows us to kind of do this. Again, I'm going to kind of cheat here a little bit because I already have this sort of done. But this is the command that you need to kind of run. And if you recall back to our package JSON, it is basically running this thing called hygen, and it is creating a new migration based on a template that's in our underscore templates directory. It'll ask you for a migration name. In this case, if you give it kind of, I'm just going to give it kind of a dummy one. In this case, I'm going to say something like test. It'll create a new migration for you based on that template. It's very straightforward. The template just has sort of an up and down function. Later on, you can add a bunch of different things to it. All of our migrations and almost everything that we do with SQL is using Keasley, I think is the name. But it allows us to basically write queries in using this. The query builder is type safe. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add the new sort of migration for our comment feature. I kind of already have it. I'm going to delete this guy for now. And if I go in here, we've got sort of the up and we've got kind of the down. And to run it again, just like before, you go into your SST console, you click on the migrations tab. In our case, we kind of already had it, so it's already been sort of applied, but you hit apply and it'll kind of apply it for you. And then the next thing you can kind of do is, just like before, let's just run the query. It shows that the table is there. Obviously, there's no data in the table, so that's kind of done. Now that we have that, now we're ready to actually implement our code in our domain function. So if I close this, if I go back here, I'm basically just implementing the add comment and the get comments function. You can kind of see it's a pretty straightforward SQL query. But written, obviously, like the query builder is kind of like creating the SQL query out of this. What's sort of neat about this one is that, like, I think it's sort of set up properly. It'll like yell at me if the things are not set up the right way. But in this case, I'm just going to sort of stick with the sort of standard thing. But But the type safety aspect of this makes it so that if I was just writing SQL as a string, it's not likely to kind of catch some of these things. Whereas here we're able to rely on the type safetyness of Kaisley. And I have a huge sort of behind the scenes on how this is kind of wired up. I'm going to kind of skip it in this case, but you can go in and you can kind of look at how this sort of works. We sort of talk about, how is it actually connecting to the database, and like where are those things sort of coming from. But anyway, for now we have that kind of up and running. Let's do the next sort of step. It's weird that it's taking a second to load. So the next bit we're going to do is we're going to connect this to our GraphQL API. Or in the tutorial, we kind of talk about why are we using GraphQL. I'll just give you kind of a high level bit of it. The big piece of this really being, as compared to REST sort of API, is the fact, again, I go back to this notion of we're thinking about a code base that's going to be around for a really long time. And so one of the things that you might end up doing is that you might end up having multiple clients for your API. So say, for example, we had we have our Reddit sort of application here, and if you visited this on the web, we would potentially, let's say we're going to implement this comments feature, right? We might potentially show a bunch of the comments right on the homepage itself. Whereas if you looked at it on your phone, we might not. Because we don't have a ton of like screen real estate, we maybe don't want to show all of the comments there. We might just want to show the comments count. In that case, if you're working in kind of the REST API context, you would need to go basically, like if you think about like a team that's working on this, they would have to go talk to the API folks and be like, hey, can you guys add a new API endpoint for us for this new homepage that we're creating that does not have the full comments, it just has the comments count. And the team has to sort of go off and kind of like implement it. And then over time, you can imagine that you're basically maintaining these very specific API endpoints that are very specifically tied to the front end or the client that you have. And the more clients you have, the more specific API endpoints that you end up kind of adding. The thing that you want to avoid as you get larger as an organization, but also larger as an application, is that you want to ideally kind of decouple those things as much as possible. And that's effectively what GraphQL lets you do. GraphQL is basically saying, as an API person, I am just going to define all the relationships and all the queries and actions that you can run on these relationships and the data that we have. But it's up to you as the client to decide what you want to display and all the actions that you want to run. And those things are not tied together. And so GraphQL ends up being like really, really nice just for that. And we'll kind of see that in a second and see how it sort of like plays out. The flavor of GraphQL that we're using in our starter is called Code First GraphQL. GraphQL, if you're sort of familiar, or if you're kind of getting into it even, you'll notice that there are these sort of like schemas that you kind of define in their own specific language. We decided to kind of go in a slightly different direction. One of the reasons why we sort of did that is obviously the type safety part of it, is that you get really nice type safety out of the box if you're just writing your GraphQL schemas in code, and that's TypeScript. Now you could technically get like some of the type safety or the type sort of benefits in the schema world, but the thing that I think bothered us on some level was that you had to do a bunch of code generation just to get it to work across the clients that you're using, and we'll look at this in a little bit in detail. And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what is kind of like the best setup for this, and we ended up actually finding this library called Pothos, which we have sort of mentioned before. And we'll see, how that ends up being maybe a better setup than the other way of doing things. That being said, again, like that's sort of totally up to you. If you're used to writing GraphQL, or if you have that kind of background, then you should totally, use the setup that you're sort of familiar with. But if you're sort of new to it, given the setup that we have here, and you'll sort of see as we kind of work through how nice it sort of feels, that it might be a compelling reason for you to kind of like give this a try. The other thing that we've done is GraphQL by default weren't necessarily thinking about the Lambda environment that it was supposed to run in, and so the packages that you would find that that do this for you are not really performant in a Lambda function, and so we spend a bunch of time trying to make that a little bit better. And if you're kind of curious about how like this whole thing is sort of wired up, the entire GraphQL setup, there's a giant behind the scenes block here that talks about the whole thing, because we do some like code gen stuff in there as well, and we'll see that a little bit as we kind of like work through it. All right. So a key part. So now we're kind of ready to sort of like describe this new comments feature in our GraphQL API. A key part of Pothys and this code first approach is this idea of backing models, which is basically saying, hey, you want to expose this new, let's say, comment type into your GraphQL API. But what is it actually powered by? Like, what's in this case, what is sort of backing it? And in our case, it's very clear. It's being backed by like something that lives in our database. However, and you might, if you've sort of dabbled in the GraphQL sort of database world a little bit, there's this trend of effectively just exposing everything that's in your database as an API, where people go, hey, why do I even need an API layer? Why can't I just like, expose the whole thing as is? Why do I need to have this backing models concept? Why don't you just go sort of do it directly? One of the sort of values of having this sort of separation is this thing that we're about to do, which is when we're defining the schema, we're able to say, okay, given that we have a comments table and each row in the comments table is a comment, I might not want to expose all the fields in the table to my GraphQL API, or that could be one sort of requirement, or it could be that I want to maybe like play around with how some of that is sort of displayed, and show it in a way that's actually specific to the API. So again, this is the hint here is that we're touching on another sort of concept of sort of decoupling, which is if you have things that are really tightly sort of tied together. In this case, let's assume your database was directly going into your front end without sort of an API layer in between. That sort of tight coupling means that over time you're giving up this ability or this flexibility as your application or your organization sort of grows. We can talk about that more in depth at sort of a later point, but essentially what we're sort of doing here, and I'm going to open this up in our code. So we've got these two files. So we've got this article.ts file, and we have another article .ts file, but this is the GraphQL type. And what you can kind of think of is the article.ts that we've sort of looked at so far, our domain code is basically going to be exposed in some ways through our API. And in our GraphQL API, we're going to go out and now define the types that our clients are going to be expecting. So at the top, we have a type, a GraphQL API type called article type. In this case, we can't use the exact same variable name because we have something called an article, but you can almost think this is an article type. And where this type is actually coming from is a row in our articles table. And in that row, there's a set of fields, and we want to expose these fields. And there might be some other fields that maybe we don't want to expose, or, and we'll see this in a second, we might want to expose this other field that goes and grabs data from somewhere else and does something else with it. So anyway, so the point here is that we're grabbing the row from our SQL, from the SQL query, which is, in this case, it's sort of a TypeScript object. And then out of that, we are exposing a few set of these things. And we're telling GraphQL, we're saying, hey, this is an ID, this is a string, and this is another string. These types are GraphQL specific types, so they aren't. I'm using the word type here, but I'm using them in two different contexts. One of them is sort of a type in the GraphQL context, and the other one is just a type in a TypeScript context. And this might be a little bit confusing when you first come into GraphQL, because why are there these sort of two types? But essentially, what this is this entire thing is a description of what the article looks like to the rest of the world that is going to be using our API. And the rest of the world that's using our API might not be, it's not like our GraphQL API, which is literally just like an HTTP API. It's not like we're shipping TypeScript in it, right? So you have to sort of define and describe the types in a way that the client can understand, and the client can then take that and be like, oh, these then translate into these other TypeScript types. One of the neat things that we do in this setup, and the reason why we sort of recommend this quite a bit, is because that we try and share these types across the board. So when we define this schema here, the types that we're sort of generating, we code gen them so that your client can then pick them up. And we'll see this a little bit later. Your client will make TypeScript queries against this. So it would be nice if I could sort of pull up Excalidraw here, but I think it'll take a little bit too long to sort of whiteboard it out. But essentially what it is that, you've got you're making this query, a SQL query that returns a TypeScript object. That TypeScript object we then use to describe sort of our API on a GraphQL level, which effectively gets turned into text as it's getting sent, or strings as it's getting sent through an HTTP API that then our client is going to pick up. And it's going to use the same types that were generated while we described it here to then sort of convert it and pull it back into our client. So it's almost like you can kind of think it's like the client is making calls in as strings, but when it sort of deserializes them, these strings, it then is going to use the types that we generated on our backend to kind of pull them together. There's a whole lot going on there, but you'll kind of see how it plays well together once we sort of hit the front end. But anyway, so this file is effectively describing our GraphQL schema. And you can kind of see there are like a few things that we're doing here that will seem sort of familiar. So there's an article type, there's an article query, which is basically like, hey, give me a certain article. There's an articles query, which is give me a list of these articles. And then we have kind of a mutation, which is like you're basically allowing you to do an action, which is create an article. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a second. But so just going along, we're now going to add a new comment type. So exactly like this article type that we just spent like 10 minutes talking about, we're going to add one here. It's exactly like the one below it. It's being backed by the SQL query from our comment table that we created in a migration some time ago. And then what we're going to do is we're going to return that as a part of the article. So this is kind of the neat bit here, is that, so this is what we've sort of added here, is this article type now already is sort of diverged from the underlying article row that you have in your database, right? So we don't have a comments sort of row or like object within the row of an article on the database. What we're kind of doing here is we're telling our GraphQL API, or our schema rather, that when somebody asks for the comments field while getting an article, this is how you resolve it, or this is a resolver function, which is basically saying, take this given article and then go to our domain code and go grab all the comments for that article ID. And what this comments field is returning, and what we're telling our GraphQL schema, is that it's returning a list of comments, like this type that we just sort of described here. What's really neat about this is, and obviously this is getting into sort of GraphQL, what's really neat about this is that we are describing the relationships on a sort of schema level. The reason why I wanted to have both of these files open here is because if you go back to our domain code, here we're thinking really in terms of just the domain concept of like, hey, there's an article, there's a bunch of actions that you can do on the article. And it deals with, the actual code here deals with how it's sort of stored. The sort of GraphQL definition of this is basically decoupled from that, in that we're thinking about it in terms of this this API that we want to sort of give to the world in some ways. They don't need to know obviously how it's sort of like implemented or what our domain code sort of looks like. It can diverge, just like what we did over here. It can diverge from our sort of like internal implementation. But again, this goes back to like this key concepts are decoupling a little bit and maintainability in the future, which is you can imagine these two files being worked on by two separate teams almost, right? Like the team that sort of works on the sort of domain code for your article or the different domains that you might have ends up being kind of different from the one that is working on your API. Okay. That said, so we have that. So far what we have is, if you were to go fetch an article, we're also going to be returning your comments alongside it. The next bit we're going to look at is sort of queries and mutations, which is like, how do you actually fetch it and how do you actually add to it? So a query, just really quickly, we don't have to go into too much detail here, and because we kind of touched on it already, a query is basically defining, when I run a query called article, it's literally just called article, like that's the name of it. It's returning a specific type. And again, this is a GraphQL type, right? The one that we sort of defined here. This query has a bunch of arguments, and the arguments, it also needs to sort of specify what is the type of the thing that you're asking for. What is the actual arg in the arguments that you're asking for? And is it required or not? In this case, we're asking for an article ID, and it's actually required. And then you have a resolver function, which is basically telling GraphQL, okay, given that this query has been made and given that this has been sort of passed in, how do I actually, do the work for this thing? The same thing for our articles one as well. And we kind of talk about that over here. The mutations one is sort of similar as well, in that we have literally a mutation. We're going to use this a little bit later in the front end part, is called create article. It takes a bunch of arguments. So to create an article, we need the URL, we need the title. And in this case, both of these are required fields and both of these are strings. To actually resolve it, we call our domain function. We pass that in. And then what it returns is a newly created article. Pretty straightforward. So let's go ahead and create a new mutation. We're going to create a create article. We're going to create the add comment mutation, and we're going to add it right in here. Just like the other guy that we just looked at, it's pretty straightforward. It takes two arguments, the article ID. So where is this comment being added, and what is the text of the comment? Both of them are required fields. And it's going to call into the domain code that we implemented in the last chapter. So pretty straightforward there. Now I have sort of a behind the scenes section on this one's actually kind of useful in the sense that if you're coming from kind of a REST API world, this little behind the scenes section sort of talks about, you might want to think about API design a little bit differently when it comes to GraphQL. The example I was giving before, of like how our website could have a desktop version and a mobile version, and those two things could be different, and they could be requesting sort of different things. In the REST API world, you might just end up creating sort of different API endpoints for their different home pages. But in the GraphQL world, we don't want to do that. And so there's a slightly different way of kind of designing these things, and that this sort of section kind of goes through that. There's also a video that you can kind of watch on getting a better feel for it. The upshot of it really is that you want to write sort of, you want to think about your GraphQL schema and your API, again, in terms of these types or these entities that you have, the relationships between them, the actions that you can carry out on them on a granular level, as opposed to thinking more in terms of, hey, for my homepage, for the entirety of my homepage, I want this one call, and this all the things that I want in that call should be sort of broken down. All right. Now we're actually ready to work on our front end. This is sort of where this is kind of obviously the fun part, but it's also the part that like that's going to tie all these things to sort of bring them all together. Let me just go back here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a call to our in our homepage. We're going to want to display this this new comments bit. So what I'm going to kind of do is we're going to replace this entire query that we have. So what we're looking at here, and we'll sort of break this down a little bit more, but essentially our homepage, it's very straightforward. It's showing like our little nav bar at the top. It's showing the list of all the articles that we have, and per article, it's basically showing the name of the article, the sort of domain that it is, and it links to the kind of the article page itself that you have as well. If you didn't have anything and you might remember the screen, it says, hey, post your first link. And so this query is basically fetching all of the articles that we have. So this is kind of the this is the tie-in between the schema and the schema that we just worked on, the GraphQL schema that we just worked on, and the client that we have. You can kind of see what this is saying is, it's using a React hook. You might be sort of familiar with these called use typed query. And it's basically passing in the name of the query. So in this case, we are going after the articles query. So if I go back here, you'll recall that we defined our articles query here, which is basically just like returning a bunch of articles. And what we are doing in this query is we're saying for the article, like this is what I actually want in there. I want the ID, I want the URL, I want the title. Now, when we go back here, these are all the fields in the article. We added this new comments thing, and we want to say that we would want, put in the new code here. We want the new comments bit in there. So what we added, and we made some other changes, but we'll come back to that in a second. What we added here is we're saying, hey, I want you to return the comments as well with the article. In this case, I just want the comment ID because I am not going to be displaying the actual comment as a text. I'm just going to display the count. So this is, for me, just the IDs are fine for now. The other bit that we did, you might have sort of noticed, is this like additional types name thing. And we'll come to that in sort of the next chapter, but it's effectively related to one of the neat things our GraphQL client on the front end does. It's related to sort of how these things are kind of cached. But anyway, so what this is sort of doing is is now we're saying in our front end we are ready to fetch the comments that we have now exposed in our GraphQL schema. We talk about the use typed query bit here, and there's a sort of a big behind the scenes section talking about exactly how that works. I'll just give you kind of a high level overview of this. What this is doing is it's pulling in this React hook from, not from one of like your NPM packages, but actually from your own app. This is coming from your workspace. So this is my SST app is what my app is called. In that, I have a GraphQL workspace that you might recall that we had talked about a long time ago, the beginning of this tutorial. And then from there, there's a file called Urkel that this is sort of pulling from. And if you recall, the GraphQL, this directory that we had talked about was sort of a code gen directory. So I'm going to sort of collapse these guys here. And in that, there is this urkel.ts file. What this is doing, so Urkel is this is a very, very robust GraphQL client. It has a bunch of different features that allows you to really build very solid single page applications. And it does a lot of neat things out of the box that, and I've personally done this in the past, where you end up building some version of it over time. Like you have to handle things like caching, you have to handle things like loading states, invalidating the cache. And the moment you're trying to invalidate the cache, you've got some monstrosity that you end up sort of writing. So Oracle is just a much better version of that. What we're doing here that's sort of interesting is that we're using Oracle to plug into the types that our GraphQL schema is code genning. So every time we make a change to our to sort of our, and I'm going to show this here a little bit, to our types here. Let's see. Actually, I don't know. I don't know what's going on with my. Sorry. I am not sure why my autocomplete isn't working in this case. I'll come back to that in a second. But what this is sort of doing, I can show it in kind of a different way. In that, what this is sort of doing is it is connecting to this thing called GenQL, which is basically generating the actual types that we want to be using based on our GraphQL schema. And so in this case, our front end is aware of the types that that we had generated on our backend. And so that's part of the reason why when we're pulling in this use typed query, it's basically allowing us to make, in this case, sort of typed query. So it can sort of figure out, hey, there is a mistake in the query that you're making, because it's sort of aware of exactly the types that you're sort of using. So that whole, I had this bit that I kind of talked about before about how, the GraphQL is going through an HTTP and it needs to be sort of deserialized, and those strings, now we need to pull these types in. This is how we're pulling these types in. The other little bit maybe to kind of think about here is that, the type stuff is really for our local development experience. When this thing gets pushed, those types don't really exist. So yeah, maybe at some point I'll maybe kind of do like a bigger stream on how these things are kind of wired up together. But if you go back to the tutorial, we have sort of behind the scenes kind of talking about that on some level. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to render our the comments that we have. So we're going to go down here, and I think the tutorial is telling us to replace, oops. I think the tutorial, the mic is sort of blocking the keyboard for me a little bit. I think the tutorial is telling us to replace this guy, right? So, okay. All right. So we have what we've sort of added here is essentially the comments count, which is just getting the sort of like total number of comments that we have in the thing. And we're getting the we're displaying a link to view the comments, which is the same thing as the link that that just takes you to the sort of the article page. And we had sort of talked about this. We've got basically two routes in our thing, and we use this thing called React Router that allows us to handle those two routes, because our application is a single page application. There's a behind the scenes kind of talking about how that sort of works. Most of you should be familiar with this at this point. And then finally, what we're going to do is we're going to add some styles. So the styles bit that we have is also written in TypeScript. At this point, let me add that in there. It's literally just like two little bits just to sort of like space things out a little bit. But our styles here that you'll kind of notice, there are two things of note. So first is just like everything else, the sort of the type safety bit. So this thing is going to yell at me every time I sort of make a mistake. It allows me to make sure that these things don't have obviously these mistakes. But the other neat thing that's happening here is, in this case, it's basically it's allowing us to write styles for specific components. So if I go back to this, there's something else that seems off. I need to come back to that in a second. But what it's letting me do is basically saying, hey, for this HTML component that I have, give me the sort of like give me a class, a CSS class that is going to affect just this guy. And so behind the scenes, and I kind of talk about this over here. Behind the scenes, I'll just show you that really quickly. There's a lot more to this, but behind the scenes, what this is kind of doing is when I say something like this, it gets translated to a class that looks like this. And the same thing happens on the CSS side as well, is that like a class like this gets sort of translated into something that looks like that. And this basically does sort of the replacement for you. The advantage, aside from the fact that like it's isolating styles per component, the advantage of vanilla extract, the thing that we're using, is that this is done at build time. So this is not something that, like, what it's shipping, the CSS that it's shipping is effectively just like normal CSS. In fact, there's a concept of sort of variables that's in there as well, that's just piggybacking normal sort of CSS variables. So a lot of like what it's doing, the end result of what's being sort of shipped is just sort of normal CSS. The way you're writing it obviously gives you sort of a better development experience. And this goes back to the other point that I was sort of making about some of the type stuff as well, is that a lot of what's being affected here on some level is all the local stuff. So when this stuff actually gets shipped, like there are no sort of types involved at runtime, and all this is sort of catering towards the fact that we want it to be sort of maintainable in the long term. This guy is yelling at me. I'm not sure if it's VS Code that's not picking up the type, but we'll come back to that. Let's see if it actually is causing a problem or not. Let's go back to our application. And what we have here, and I think that one's just sort of VS Code that's sort of causing a problem. But what we kind of have here is this new comments count that we're getting that's being kind of displayed. If you click on it, it will take you again to that page that we had from before. We haven't done anything else. But the neat thing, if you remember, is that, we went through and we defined our domain code just by thinking about articles and comments. We went and defined our GraphQL API just by thinking about the relationship between our sort of GraphQL, like the entities within our GraphQL schema. We then went to our front end, and our front end decided, hey, I don't need all of the comments. I'm just going to display the count. So I'm just going to pull out exactly what I sort of need. And it kind of did that in that case. So now that's just sort of tying together all the things that we've been talking about so far. The next step that we're going to do is basically just wrap up the actual the comments feature itself. So now we're able to display the comments. Let's make sure that we're able to sort of add them. We're going to go to our next page. And the page that we're going to go to is our articles page. And sometimes I think so there's this bit about so this one's sort of yelling. I'm pretty sure it's VS Code that's having an issue. Every once in a while, the TS server within VS Code causes a problem, but I'm thinking that's what it is. All right, so coming here, so this is our article page. If you remember the page itself, there isn't a whole lot in that page, right? It's just displaying the entire article itself. So you can kind of see that's sort of what it's doing. It makes a very simple query in this case. We're calling the article. We're doing the article query in this case. We're passing in the article ID. So I'm just going to go back. I'm going to close the homepage for a second. I'm going to go back to our article query, the one that we have here, right? It's expecting an article ID as you would expect. And it calls our domain code. So that's kind of what it's doing. It's grabbing the article ID in this case through React Router use params, which is basically saying, we have a route. Maybe I'll open that up. We have a route in our main file called article / :ID. When I say use params, the hook that React Router has, and I grab the ID out of it, it's basically just grabbing, that URL from there. So I take the URL, I feed that into our into our GraphQL query, and I get a bunch of stuff out of it. We're now going to replace this query with this new little bit, which again, the big change that we're kind of making here is we are now fetching the comments. But unlike the homepage, we want the text of the comments, because we're going to display the comments in this case. And just like sort of before, there's this thing that we're doing, which I'm going to touch on towards the end of this, is we're sort of specifying like what are the types of the comments that are coming back. This is specific to this to the client that we're using. Let me go back here. And now before we actually fix the use memo, like the thing that, before we fix the import, let's just quickly put in the mutation for adding a comment. So this is how we're going to allow our users to basically add a comment. And this add comment mutation, if you recall, is again coming from our GraphQL sort of definition. We have sort of the add comment defined here. It takes a couple of arguments, the article ID, and the text that you'll notice. And then in this case, we are just requesting the ID back because we're not doing a ton with it, which is that we are we don't have much to sort of display, and we'll sort of see why that is. So in this case, there's not much that we actually need back in return. Sorry, to make this call, this is actually the first explicit sort of type that we need to kind of write here, is that to make this call, this function needs to know what we need to sort of pass in. And this is coming from the little form that we're going to have where they're going to be able to fill in their comment. So we're just going to define that. And aside from the form itself, it needs to know the article ID that it's going to be sort of sent into. So this comment form type that we have is pretty much basically just saying, look, here's what our type mutation kind of needs. Okay, and now we get to render these things. So let's go down into our very simple page at this point. Below the article itself, we're going to render all of our comments. And we haven't added the styles yet, so we'll come back to that in a second. We're going to then render our comment form. This looks a little bit bigger, but bigger than what we've had so far, because on submit, what this guy is going to be doing is basically just calling the add comment hook that we sort of set up top. And yeah, it passes in the text that we get from the form, and we pass in the article ID. That's from the current thing. And we have a little add comment button, and this is obviously the text area for the form itself. Let's go out and fix some of these imports here. There's like a use memo import that we're kind of using. Make sure I have this in properly. And this other one that we're sort of using is this button. The starter comes with this with a custom button, and the thing that it allows us to do is it sets loading states. So in this case, it'll show a little bit of a spinner when you are when it's submitting the comment, and we'll see that in action in a second. Finally, let's add some styles. There's a little bit more here compared to obviously the styles that we added the last time around, but there isn't a whole lot. We'll just look at it really quickly. The comments list, we want to show some styles there, which is basically just like using like the list tag that we have, and per comment, we're just like spacing some stuff out. And then the form as well, just like spacing some stuff out, and the button as well, sorry, spacing it out as well. What's neat is this is for the comment, we want to show a little bit of a border, and we want to use the same border color or the divider color, let's say, across our application. And in this case, it's like we're able to sort of store that again in code as opposed to in CSS. And so we have like a vars file that basically has all of our let's try and go into that file that has all of our sort of styles that we have. And you can create multiple themes. I don't have that in the starter, but you can create a dark mode, you can create a light mode. And if you recall, all of these get stored as normal sort of CSS variables at build time. So all the sort of fancy stuff that's happening doesn't affect your user. Your user is just going to get regular sort of HTML, JS, and CSS rather. Okay, so coming back into that, yeah, that comment guy is causing a bit of a problem. I wonder what's going on there. Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. So after we've done the import, let me make sure I've done the import. Oops. I'll sort of close this for now. And I think we should be able to test it, though I have a weird feeling something is up. Let's see. Let's try submitting our comment. Okay. So we submitted the comment. There are a couple of things that happened. One, you might have noticed sort of the spinner. And now that we've sort of submitted our comment, if I go back to kind of our comments page, you'll notice that our comment count has kind of been updated as well. So if I go back in here, I'm going to do this again because there's something neat that's happening behind the scenes that is sort of worth sort of showing. I'm going to submit the comment again. Right. So there are a few things that are going on here that are, again, going back here that are worth of note. So if you notice, we looked at our code so far, and this might just be VS Code being kind of weird because of the TS server. But if you looked at our code so far, we actually don't have anything in here. If you think about, like, the on submit for a comment doesn't do anything fancy on displaying our comments. So after we added a new comment, there wasn't, like, we're not sitting there making another specific call to sort of refetch this. And you'll also notice that the spinner sort of like lasts all the way through till like all of it is sort of shown. And then finally, I was doing it in kind of a funny way. And finally, when you actually go back to this page, you'll notice that the count gets sort of updated and there's a bit of a refresh. So let's work through this one again really quickly. When I'm here and I go back here, there isn't a request being made because Urkel, the client that we're using, caches this for you. So it knows that this request has already been made in the past. And so it gives you this like very snappy sort of experience, right? So because of the caching, it displays it right on the spot, and it might make a call behind the scenes, and you can sort of configure that or whatever. But if I add a comment, now that one's a bit different. So if I add a comment, and I go back to this page, you'll notice that it's doing a little bit of a refresh. And the reason it's doing that is because of these things that we added up top. So in the case, I'll open up the homepage as well. In the case of the homepage, we're telling it that, hey, this query that we're making is expecting these types in return. It's expecting the article type and the comments type in return. And it's smart enough to sort of figure out that because, ignore the sort of VS Code being sort of weird here, but because the add comment call or the add comment mutation is affecting a comment, it now knows that this query needs to be refetched, and it does it sort of automatically. It also knows that when I add a new comment here, and I'm not going to add it just yet, but when I add a new comment in the article page, that query as well is expecting a comment field in return. And so when a new comment gets added, refetch that query as well. So when I add this, the query that is rendering this page gets refetched automatically. So in this case, when I do this, it makes that call. And the way this sort of shows up is that the article query that we have has a flag called stale, which is basically telling you that it now has stale data and that it's being refetched. And so in the case of our button, we're able to put in a little loading state that handles the fact that the stale data is being sort of refetched. And yeah, and so that's about it really. So we kind of talk about the auto refetching stuff down here a little bit. Now you might be kind of wondering, why do I sort of like care about some of the stuff? Again, this goes back to kind of our core thesis, is that we want to build and give you kind of a setup that works for a really long period of time. Eventually, and in our experience, eventually you end up creating some version of Urkel out there. Like internally, you're going to be you're going to want to handle sort of cache invalidation, and Urkel is like really sort of powerful in doing some of those things, and is one of the reasons why we sort of recommend this. So our application is kind of complete at this point. So we have, you can add sort of more links here. I'm going to add one more. And you can add kind of comments to it. And that's it. And our sort of basic sort of Reddit clone is kind of done. The final step of this, and I can kind of do this in the background while everything is sort of happening. The final step of this is to actually do kind of a deploy. I'm just going to close all of our local environment things. I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to go SST deploy -stage prod. And that's the thing that we sort of ask you to do, which is basically saying, and this is sort of, this goes back to kind of the beginning of what we were sort of talking about when we first started. What this is basically saying is, deploy your application to a completely separate stage. And the reason we do this, in this case, we're using literally the string prod. You can call it whatever you want. Because if you recall, my local one was called J. And so by sort of separating those two out in some ways, I can make sure that the next time I'm working on the J version of my application, it doesn't affect the prod version that my users are using, right? So it's important that you sort of like separate these things out. In fact, we would ask you to go a little bit further, and we don't quite do this in the tutorial, but to go a bit further, what we sort of recommend is separating these out into like completely separate AWS accounts, so that you don't have the chance of somebody accidentally messing up some of the prod resources that you have. So ideally, have two different AWS accounts, one for development where all of your developers or everybody in your team can kind of work together and everything's sort of namespaced according to the stage, and then one you have for your production that is completely separate. Some other advantage that you get out of this is you can set sort of resource limits that are maybe separate for these different accounts. So like AWS has some limitations, and you might want to lift some of those for your prod, but not for your dev, things like that. And then and I'm not going to do this now because this takes it's going to take a little bit as it sort of deploys everything up, is that now that your application is running in prod and you don't have SST start running, if I went to my console, my console, wouldn't quite know what to sort of connect to. So in this case, it's basically saying, hey, there's nothing running in the CLI, right? If you recall, our SST start sort of CLI starts up the server that our console connects to, and in this case, SST start is not running, so the console is not able to connect to anything locally. So for that, we have this SST console command where you can pass in the prod stage that you want to sort of connect to. So it starts up a little server on its own. It's not doing anything else. There's no other local environment stuff. It's just that little server that your console can then connect to, and then it'll help you manage basically production resources. And then finally, the recommendation that we always sort of have is, once you're ready to go live with your application, you ideally want some sort of a Git workflow. So this is basically, you're working locally, you're making changes, and your teammates are making changes. You don't want your changes to sort of override each other, and so ideally you have, you're basically working in Git, but then Git is, or GitHub or whatever you're using for your source control, is going to automatically deploy when changes are pushed to a specific branch. So let's say you have master, main, whatever that you might have that's set up specifically for prod. You can work on your own branches, and then when you merge into this branch, GitHub or Git then can trigger a deployment for you. So we call that, Git push to deploy. And there are a bunch of different providers out there that kind of do this. Us as a team, we recommend Seed. We use this internally as well. And what it basically does is it can take a GitHub repo, and it can monitor the branch that you want. And when commits are pushed to that branch, it will automatically deploy your SST app for you. As I said, you can kind of use other providers as well. In the case of other providers, you would just need to write a couple of scripts to handle this sort of workflow. So, hey, when commits come in, do a push. Let's say you want to have a pull request workflow. When the pull request branch gets when the pull request gets merged, take down that environment or take down that stage, things like that. But you would have to sort of script that on your own. Whereas for Seed, it sort of works out of the box. And that's roughly it. I think I'm sort of done. I'm sort of at the end of the tutorial. I'm just going to quickly check if anybody has any questions. I'm not seeing a whole lot out there, but hopefully you guys found this sort of useful. What we're going to do is I'm going to put timestamps around this live stream, and we're going to put this back into the tutorial itself. I know there are folks out there that prefer sort of consuming some of this in video format as opposed to going through a tutorial themselves. But in either case, the tutorial is live. It is docs.sst.dev/learn. And it should give you a good sort of setup and a good feel for all the sort of important concepts that are within SST and the starter that we ship. With that, maybe we'll give it a couple of seconds if anybody has any other questions, but otherwise we're good to go. Thanks to everybody for joining. I'm just going to hang around for another second or two. I'm just going to call Frank or Dax back in here to end the stream.